Good morning, afternoon, or lunchtime, wherever you are in the world right now. It's our pleasure from all of the team here in Plan A to host yet our session today on decoding carbon accounting for the software and IT industry. And much like Neo in the Matrix, we'll talk you through and demystify how carbon accounting is done for the software and IT industry. And we hope by the end of the presentation, you would have felt like you've taken the red pill and truly understand sustainability. We'll kick off the event in about 1 minute, just whilst we wait a few other people to join. And in the meantime, I would invite everyone who's on the call, regardless from what device you're joining, to please note in the chat from where you're joining us, because it's always fascinating to find out which part of the world you are joining us from. And hello, everyone. Munich, Berlin, Germany. All right. The German cloud. Lovely. And hello, everyone who's joined us recently. As we've noted in the chat, please drop us a line on from which part of the world are you joining us for this either lunchtime, morning, perhaps even evening session. We'll be going through and demystifying carbon accounting for the software and IT industry. And as I mentioned, for London, good morning. Hopefully the weather is good in London as well. Okay, we'll give it just another few seconds. It never is, it never is. Brilliant. I suggest we kick off the session, given that we have a wonderful international crowd already joined us. So we have a few amazing speakers today representing the team of experts I have the pleasure to work with in Plan A here. So one of our first speakers is Arianna De Bellis, who is a sustainability professional, LCA practitioner, and the carbon accounting lead, of course, in Plan A. And Ari is an environmental engineer and has spent her career providing expert advice and solutions to hundreds of clients across different industries with their environmental emissions management. And we're talking about software, automotive, banking, financing. Ari's done it all. And she's here to really talk you through and demystify perhaps the carbon accounting journey for your company. And the second speaker, we have one of our key experts, who's Larry Dszouza. And Larry's also an environmental engineer. And he has created digital solutions for software companies, automotive production, and you can say hi to Larry as well. And Ari, if you want to join the stage, just so people see your smiling face. Larry has worked and provided solutions for the automotive production industry, waste management, fashion, food manufacturing, and we're kind of gathering all of their experience and channeling this into one presentation where we'll talk you through step by step, effectively, how to manage your emissions, how to report the emissions of your company, and really how to understand to monitor the key aspects. And finally, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm your host, Dr. Dzhordzhio Naldzhiev. And to finish, of course, the trifecta of engineering nerds, I'm also an environmental engineer by background. And together with the rest of the experts in the sustainability solutions team in Plan A, what we do is we ensure the technical rigor of the Plan A platform and that every single calculation, feature, or process development is supported by evidence and actually enhanced by empirical evidence. So I'd like to thank you for attending the event today, and I hope we have a really engaging session. And Larry, if we can go to the next slide. For us, this is really a conversation with all of you, I must say. We want to learn from you as much as you learn from us as well. Well, hopefully you'll learn a little bit more from us. So we'll be using Slido for all of our questions, our Q&A. So please open up any digital device that you might have separate from the one, ideally separate from the one that you're using, or maybe on a separate tab. Join the link because we have quite a few questions, interactive discussions, and we'll also use it for the Q&A towards the end of the session. So throughout the presentation, please feel free to add any question that you might have on Slido, and we'll make sure to go through as many as possible at the end of our session. All right, so let's deep dive straight in. And as a classic presentation, we really believe in the power of evidence. And what we wanted to understand and almost provoke you to begin with is, in your sense, what's the ideal length of a webinar? Just to make sure we've got our choices right. And if you say 15 minutes now, we'll give you a very rapid run through our slides and call it a day. Not really. This was a joke, I must say. Okay, so we've got some good evidence. And the key point we're trying to reveal here is we're always trying to optimize our approach using data. So for these sessions going forward, we're going to leverage actually some of the evidence and opinions that you provide and feedback to us. And we're going to change future webinars as well to effectively cater to your demands. So most of you, the majority, I would say, prefer a 45 minutes, which gives us just enough time to grab lunch. Some of you want the full hour break to dedicate it on learning and development, which is awesome to see. And 7% of you would very much enjoy an AI version of myself, Larry and Ari, that you can talk to throughout the end of time, which is brilliant. We're very much honored by this. We won't go through the endless inception time today, or we won't start it. However, we have about 45 to 50 minutes, I would say. So I would say democracy prevailed, and we've roughly got it right with the length of our webinar. So we can actually move on to the substantial bit, which is great to hear. Thank you for the feedback. So let's go to the next slide, please, Larry. Okay, so of course we shall start with some Bernie Sanders to inspire us on this lovely morning or lunchtime. But on a serious note, to kick off this webinar, we actually did some research into attention span. That is because for many of you on the call, this is one of the key metrics for customers' engagement, right? How long does my user stay on the platform, interact with my platform? How can I increase that in some shape or form? So today, what you will learn is how the attention span of your customer or your client or your prospect, and even yourself, is linked to the emissions of your company and the software products that we and yourself will use. And at the end of the webinar, we'll also reveal the amount of emissions released associated with this webinar today. And on this point, let's dive straight in. So your CPO, CTO, or CEO and management team are probably knee-deep in various metrics measuring company performance. And actually, Larry, if we can also click on the slide, brilliant. So your NPS, CSAT, MRR, time spent on platform, churn. I mean, you're all familiar with those terms, I'm sure. You hear them probably on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis. And a lot of these metrics are effectively linked to how often and how long users actually use the platform, at least the user-focused ones. But how often have you actually been asked, well, what happens if we increase our users tenfold, if we grow so rapidly? And what if our users actually do spend double the time on our platform? Would that mean our emissions would also increase tenfold and then double, or not? And we will actually deep dive into some of these findings today. And what we hope to illuminate you is exactly how the calculations are done, so you truly feel empowered to take ownership of the sustainability journey of your own company. And actually, I would encourage you to take a minute and look out of the window today. So don't focus on the screen, whatever device. I mean, if you're driving and listening to us as a podcast on a mobile phone, please keep your eyes on the road. You might be doing that, hopefully not. But I just want you to look outside for a second, because I want us to remind ourselves on why are we doing this session and the intrinsic reasons of why sustainability matters. I'm hoping you're not based in a basement or a casino floors without any view to the outside world, because the fundamental learnings we're going through today is to show you how to measure the impact of your company on the real world out there. So all the use of any software that you use, whether it's apps on your phone, whether it's the product that your company creates, has a real tangible impact on the environment. So think anytime we open a laptop, it's not quite we burn a piece of wood and you can imagine the emissions going into the atmosphere, not quite. So we'll go through and talk you through how emissions are calculated. But I really want you to look at the outdoor environment almost as a reminder. Think of yourself growing up, playing on the grass. And this is really the reason about why we do these webinars, is to take the concepts of how software and carbon accounting and how software emissions are measured, and really help you understand how you can reduce them and therefore preserve one of the most fundamental treasures that we have, which is nature itself. And I don't mean that as an environmentalist, which I am, but what we're really trying to do with this session is try to help you gain control and an understanding of how we can actually measure the emissions coming out of those products, and how can we reduce them. So how can we actually reduce the common impact that the products we use every day have on the environment? So let's go into the next slide, please. Now, what we really want to understand is you as our overall audience is what's the main reason why you joined our webinar today, perhaps. What's the fundamental underlying reason why your business wants to measure its emissions today? And we've given you a host of options, and you can also choose other, but it's really important for us. And actually, if you did click other, perhaps you would like to also note in the chat what some of those reasons might be. Okay. So far, the majority of you are clicking other, which is fascinating. So I'd very much encourage you to engage with us in the chat and state what this other mysterious reason might be. But a large proportion of you effectively say it's policy driven, which is understandable. That's very true for a lot of other industries as well. So you're not alone. A lot of the industries that we work with on a day-to-day basis happen to have an industry-associated policy on EU level, on an international level. And Elena has shared in the chat that she'd like to introduce more sustainability monitoring and policies at her institute, which is great. And hopefully after this session, you feel more empowered to explain in human language what those sustainability initiatives should be and how can you actually take ownership of them. It's an investor requirement, Helene mentioned, which is another very valid reason. This is what we're seeing with a lot of our clients, is their investors are actually putting pressure on them to understand their emissions, because from an investor perspective, this really helps them gauge how well even the company is managed. That's sometimes used as a proxy. Brilliant. But it seems to be quite a lot of others in policy. So it's a really good distribution. And I would say that's very typical for what other sectors also look like. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Larry. So now we understood the underlying reasons why you want to undertake sustainability action and why you want to measure emissions. But we're actually, statistically speaking, we're so overwhelmed by information and notifications that as a species, we're really losing our ability to tell stories. And on average, every day, every one of you right now receives around 280 notifications just from our phone, right? And this doesn't include emails, the Jira tickets, the Confluence pages, Slack messages. And actually, brain rot was the Oxford word of the year in 2024. And I think this is a very key point, and why we're doing these presentations, trying to simplify the language, because we're bulldozed by information, and it is really exhausting and distracting. And if we go to the next point, statistically speaking, in the last few minutes, at least 80% of you have lost their attention on this webinar and have either looked at your phone, stopped your child from screaming, or maybe eating the cat food, or stopped at a red light if you happen to be driving. And that's natural. And this is because we're overwhelmed by information. But because your attention span is so precious, what we're trying to do with this webinar is really create a story that you can use later on, even within your own internal teams, to communicate how to take ownership of your sustainability journey. So before I pass on to my expert colleagues, I'll tell you the 3 things you will learn today, and we'll specifically focus the webinar on understanding how emissions are measured and recorded, so almost taking you through the steps or the underlying concepts that are really important on how to measure emissions. Then we're going to show you some typical benchmarks from companies like yours, so you really get a good practical sense of what are the activities or areas that are likely to dominate the day-to-day data collection and your sustainability journey and that of your company. And finally, Larry is going to deep dive into a specific hotspot and actually show you how energy and electrons flow through the virtual system, really demonstrating the flow of carbon, as it were, with each use of your own software. So please relax, sit back, and enjoy this educational ride. And now let's dive straight in.
Thank you so much, Dzhordzhio, and hello, everybody. So yes, to start, we wanted to show you a bit of an overview of the current situation. And the reason we want to show you this graph is because a lot of people in this sector, sustainability is an add-on. Since we did a review of more than 600 companies within the IT and software sector, we found that the majority do not have a dedicated team or positions to the topic of sustainability. We have a really wide distribution on who actually takes account or responsibility for this. And the reason we want to share these statistics is because for some of our clients, this is true as well. And we also want to share a message of hope, since even if this is not on top of your job, this is why we do these master classes. Our ultimate goal is to create sustainability experts through these sessions and through our platform as well. Our team has spent all their career in sustainability, and we are still learning. So we understand that this can be a challenge, but we really, with the next part of the sessions, we want to tell you practically how you can measure your emissions, and also in future editions, how you can reduce them. So to start from the basics, I wanted to really give an overview on what we will focus on. We're talking, of course, the greenhouse gas protocol, and with the highlight on the relevant sector-specific operations. And we will go more and more in depth going ahead in this session. So maybe many of you know already, but maybe some of you are not super familiar with this, but the greenhouse gas protocol has the 3 scopes, and we can start from the scope 1, in which we have the direct emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by a company, and such as for heating or refrigerating of the facilities or the company-owned servers, for example. While in scope 2, we have the indirect emissions from purchased electricity, such as the power used in the office buildings or in data centers, for example. In scope 3, we have the other indirect emissions from the value chain, and this can go from emissions that are related to software development, to employee commuting, but also to the use of a sold software product. So this was for a very high-level overview, and I want to understand a bit our audience with the questions on the next slide. If you have ever calculated the corporate carbon footprint of your company, if you're already gone through these challenges, so maybe you know where the tricky parts are. If you have never gone through this, or you're joining our sessions to learn more about it, if you're like in the midst of this and want to understand more. Okay, very, very interesting. Many of our audience is using only spent data, which is a very common situation, and it's always a very good first step. And only scope 1 and 2, this is also understandable. These are the relatively easy one, so to say. But yes, this is okay, very, very interesting. So then by reading this, I'm sure that the topics we will delve in will be extremely useful for you. Okay, I think we can go ahead. So if you have done your scope 1, 2, and 3, maybe this type of emissions profile is familiar to you. If you have not, maybe good to understand it. So we have crunched numbers and analyzed more than 200 software and IT companies. And what you see here is the typical emission profile of the corporate carbon footprint of a company in this sector. As you can see from the figure, the scope 3 dominates emissions, so much so that scope 1 and 2 are barely visible. This does not mean that scope 1 and 2 are not important, but this data shows why most software and IT companies focus a lot of their effort in the scope 3, or should focus a lot of their effort on the scope 3 category. I want to highlight, though, that different companies that can have different setups in their operations. So scope 1 and 2 can be important, especially, for example, if there is data centers under the operational control of a company, or other particular situations that have specific energy-intensive hotspots that could spike the graph in a different way. But as said, like from our understanding, scope 3, it's quite relevant, and also it's quite tricky. So this is why we want to focus on this and shed some light and delve deeper into this topic. So by focusing in this scope, you can see that the scope, this is the common, profile of distribution of the scope 3 subcategories in this sector. If we zoom in, we see how the scope 3 footprint is dominated by category 11. This is the use of sold product. And this is a really helpful guideline that you can use when starting your sustainability journey, as it shows you the typical emissions and hotspots of a company like yours. And this is important to guide you on where to focus your attention when you have maybe many topics to cater to. Maybe this can give you some guidance and light on the prioritization. Again, as I mentioned before, every company is unique. Therefore, the distribution for your specific case may be different and may vary on your operations, on the data available to you. But again, it's very important to understand where the most relevant hotspots could lie. As said, so in this case, we're going to focus on the use of sold product. And from our computations, this could account on average for 30% of scope 3 emissions, but could also go to up to 90% of the emissions, depending on how the business is structured. So on the next slide, we will focus on specifically this topic. But first, again, I would like to ask you a question. If you have ever been asked to assess the carbon footprint of the service, the product, the app you sell to your users, this would be very interesting to see if this is something you don't know about or you're often asked about. I think the topic of assessing our usage of the different devices, or it could be video streaming, everything that we do on the internet, it's often quite a question, and I feel like it's often seems like a mysterious topic, and we will understand a bit better how to go about it. So many of you have never been asked. This is very interesting, but often some of our audience has been going through this. Let's see if some other is joining with another answers, but okay, I think we can go on. It's quite interesting. Let's see if you need to think about it. So again, according to GHG protocol, which is the framework that we follow, we have guidance in this topic, and especially in the topic of use of sold product. This, of course, can cater to many different things. The two main scenarios that we go through during the use phase of a product that is sold by the reporting company are the direct use phase scenario or the indirect use phase scenario. So the indirect use phase is when the product that is sold uses energy indirectly during the use of it. This could be the case for food, for example. Food does not consume energy directly, but in order to prepare food, we need to turn on our stove, heat up a pan, etc. So this is that case. It's not our case today, but it's always important to take into consideration. While for our specific case today, we will delve into the direct use phase scenario. So the products that directly consume energy during its use. In our case specifically, when we talk about a software that is sold, the end users, it's directly using the energy of the devices they are running their software in order to use this. So there is not only the direct use of energy of the software when running the app or the product, for example, but there is also several things happening in the background that allow a software to run. This category is quite complex to tackle, First of all, because the behavior of the end user is not always 100% under the control of the company reporting this. And second, each one of you may have different access to the data that is transferred to account for the use phase of this. What we can help you with is to understand through our expertise how to take into account everything that is behind that click that brings the user to enjoy the product, the app, the streaming services available on their devices, and to bring a bit more clarity on everything that seems so far away, but it's to be taken into account when we are simply watching a webinar like this one, for example, or using an app on our phone or laptops, etc. So what happens during the use phase of a software, as I said, again, it's not easy and contains several steps that the data that is transferred go through. From the computing of the information in faraway data centers to the storing, the network exchanges, and the device usage itself. This is a combination of what we call primary and secondary data. The secondary data are the data that we provide in order to account for these operations that are not directly under the control of a reporting company. And this is all the research that we do that it's available to our users. And this is combined to what we call primary data. So these are the informations that are available to you, that you have some control or some ability to gather somehow. And my dear colleague Larry will help you understand this better. But again, in order to delve a bit deeper into the topic and to understand the whole journey that an electron goes through from, again, these faraway places that seem so detached from us to what we have in our hands so often, I will leave the word to my colleague Larry to understand it better.
Thank you, Arianna. Hi, everyone. Before we go into the journey of electron, maybe what we could do is take a moment to understand what device are you using right now to watch this webinar, because Dzhordzhio mentioned that we would be analyzing what are your emissions from watching this webinar. So yeah, if you could take a moment to just go through the poll and answer what device are you on right now, would be helpful for us to do those calculations. And in the end, we are going to calculate the emissions per user and for the entire audience. So yeah, in the poll, let me know what device are you using. Okay, so we have 75% of them are on a laptop, which is understandable. Some of you are on desktop, the users on phone, and no one on the tablet yet. Let's give a few more seconds for you to answer. Okay, we can move on. Okay, we have a user also on the tablet. Okay. So when we think about software, whether it's cloud-based app, a streaming platform, or a video game, we rarely consider the energy behind every click or a scroll or a data request. But if you look behind the scenes, electrons are traveling vast distances which consumes energy at every step. So what we'll do right now is let's break down this journey of an electron and see where emissions occur in software applications. So starting from the source of power, which is the electricity generation. Now everyone has an understanding of how electricity is generated. So I'm not going to go into depth of electricity generation. But if you think every digital interaction starts with electricity generation. So this power can come from renewable sources like solar or wind, or from fossil fuels like coal and natural gas. The energy mix that is used to generate this electricity significantly impacts the carbon emissions. So renewables produce minimal emissions while fossil fuels have a high carbon impact. So what happens is then the electron flows to the user devices. So if you think of your device, the device has underlying hardware upon which there is an operating system built upon it, which acts as a layer which manages how device allocates energy to the hardware. So whether it's Windows, Mac OS, Linux, Android, or iOS, the OS ensures that applications use the right amount of processing power, memory, and networking resources so that your device can run efficiently. You may ask, why are we looking at the operating system? Because the focus is to look at the emissions of the application, the software that is running on top of this operating system. But we need to focus on the operating system as well, because this is a system which is attributable or is required as a base layer for the software to run on top of this layer. And so this is why it's important to also focus on the device operating system. And the hardware within the device really defines how much power is used by the devices. So from there, what happens is we can look at the end user devices, which is essentially the hardware that is present in the system. So it's your screen, your RAM, your storage, your CPU, GPU, everything that is within a device. And these devices can be your laptop, your smartphones, tablets, gaming consoles, or even smart home devices. Basically, if a user interacts with the software through a screen, a keyboard, or a touch interface, that's an end user device. So when the user opens and runs an application, what happens is, like, whether it's streaming, gaming, or browsing, most of today's applications need a connection to the cloud. And this is where we have the invisible energy draining component, which is networking. So most software today relies on internet connectivity, right? So whether you're using Wi-Fi or fiber optics or mobile networks, which can be 3G, 4G, or 5G network, every online request that you make requires data transmission. This includes loading a web page or sending a file or making a video call. And then we have finally the brains of the cloud, which are the data centers. So data centers are quite known to be, often known to be quite energy intensive, because they're used for heavy computing that happens in the cloud. And this is where vast amount of data are processed and stored. And these data centers power, for example, cloud applications such as Google Drive, Zoom, Microsoft 365, or ChatGPT, or it could be streaming services like Netflix, YouTube, or Spotify. And nowadays, there are also AI and machine learning models which run on the cloud and really need these data centers to power all the processes that are required to run these softwares. Inside a data center, servers rely on CPUs and GPUs. So why these are used is to process software computation. So it could be complex computations that cannot be run on the end user device and would require the cloud to do these computations. It could be memory and storage, which holds user data and applications. For example, if you're streaming a video, the data could be stored on the storage devices in the data centers, and you would be streaming those videos directly from the data center. And finally, there is the networking equipment that is transferring information within the data center and to the users. So the journey of electron is not just one way from the user to the data center, but it also flows back from the data center to the user. So there is always a data transfer that is occurring at every instant when your software application is connected to the cloud. So these are all the components from where you would account for the emissions. But essentially, emissions are not occurring in your device or in the data center or in the network, but rather the emissions are occurring at the electricity generation source. So that is where the actual emissions are happening. So what we can do next is, let's put emissions into perspective. So I have an example here, and you could also vote when I go to the Slido in the next screen. But before that, let me introduce the scenario. So we have 3 users in 3 different locations, all streaming 1,000 hours of video in total. But here's the catch: they're using different devices, and the data center supporting their stream are in different parts of the world. The question is, who has the highest emissions? So let's break it down by device, data center, and location. So first, we have a user streaming on a desktop based in Shanghai, China. And the second user is user on a PS5 gaming console based in Sydney, Australia. And finally, we have a mobile phone user who is based in Mumbai, India, and is streaming from a AWS data center. So please take a moment to submit your response, and it would be really interesting to understand where do you think would be the highest emissions. Okay, so most of you currently think that Sony PS5 could have highest emissions. Could be because gaming consoles do consume a lot of energy, and if they run on very big screens, they could consume a lot more energy compared to a phone or a desktop. Okay, surprisingly. Okay, so we have 23 responses. And I think we can go ahead and look at the results. And I think you all are right, because Sony PS5 has the highest emissions, the desktop user has the second highest emissions, and the phone user has the lowest emissions. But when we compare these users, let's look under the hood and see what are the factors that influence the streaming emissions. Because whatever you guys guessed is the correct, but let's break it down and see why those emissions are higher in certain scenarios and why they are lower for a phone, for example. So first we'll look at the device power consumption. So when we look at desktop and gaming consoles, they have really powerful CPUs and GPUs that demand more energy. And if we compare this to a laptop, then laptops are slightly better, but still use more power than mobile devices or a tablet. Mobile phones and tablets are designed for energy efficiency, so you can see they use much less power per hour of streaming. Then let's also look at the data center energy mix. So some cloud providers like Google Cloud or AWS, they invest heavily in renewables, which could reduce their emissions. And some others rely on fossil fuel heavy grids, leading to higher emissions. So for example, in Shanghai, grid is more coal dependent, so these emissions could be much higher over there. And finally, we have the network and streaming efficiency, where if you have a display with a high resolution, then naturally you would be using more bandwidth, and this could also increase the energy demand in the network. So for example, consoles and desktops are more powerful devices, and users would often stream content in 4K or in HD compared to a mobile device. So naturally, there would be more data being transferred when you think about a powerful console or a desktop compared to a phone. When it comes to collecting data from data centers for the usage to do these calculations, what we could do is send a follow-up guide on how you could collect data from AWS so that you could get data on data transfer and storage, and you can also do this calculation. So we'll do a follow-up on that. Let's go ahead and see if we have the calculations ready. I'm going to pause sharing for a moment so I can refresh. Okay, so we have the results ready. So let's analyze the numbers a bit. So desktop users have the highest emissions, followed by laptop, tablet, and finally there are the users on the phone who have the least emissions. So some things to note here are that we did some assumptions here, where we assume that the users are based in global locations. And the average emissions of an user here is 0.0314, which is 31.4 grams kg CO2 equivalent per hour of streaming. So here you go, you have your emissions from streaming this webinar on each of your devices. And now I'm going to pass the mic back to my colleague, Dzhordzhio. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks, Larry. And if we maintain our attention to this slide, just to give you some context. So if you are, let's look. So Sabina from not so sunny London, if you were to boil a cup of tea right now, the associated emissions of boiling a cup of tea in London would be broadly similar to the ones associated with you watching our webinar on your desktop. So that's why we really want to give you a practical flavor of, you know, the equivalent of emissions to other activities that, let's say, your company. So boiling a cup of tea, very similar to you watching. There you go. So you just doubled your emissions as I said this, which is a great way. If you record them, you can then put a decarbonization plan of either decarbonizing the electricity that you use or reducing the number of cups of tea that you drink. But of course, we won't do that. And actually, decarbonization is something we'll be discussing in our next webinar. So if we go to the final slide, Larry. And of course, apart from our expertise in-house, what I'd like to wrap up the slides with is here we actually have mapped all of the different services that you may need to measure, report, and reduce the emissions alongside your value chain, because planning and our ecosystem of partners effectively tailors your sustainability journey based on the individual needs of your business. And the reason we have sessions like this one is, as Ari mentioned, we are completely aware and understand that for a lot of you, sustainability might be an additional burden on top of your day job because it was a requirement for policy. And through these sessions, we really hope to inspire you to become experts and take accountability and be able to truly demonstrate how your company can not just measure and report, but actually further down the line, reduce their emissions. If we look back to our window, just to remind ourselves that the reason why we're doing this is to ultimately preserve the natural resources that are so precious to all of us for various reasons. And with this, we leave the choice in your hands, and hopefully we can support you going forward. And we'll wrap up the formal presentation part of the masterclass. And of course, if you want to know more about how we can support you, my colleagues will also post the link afterwards in the chat, through which you can look at further resources on software and IT that we have on our website. And you can also, of course, book a demo of our platform. And if we go to the next slide, please, Larry, on that point. We're always interested. We hope this session was truly inspirational and got you thinking about many different topics. But of course, you might have other ideas about learnings and key areas where you'd like further evidence, further webinars. So please share with us your feedback on which areas you'd like to hear more on and which topics we should dive deeper in future sessions. So really, this is your opportunity to give us feedback about what more would you like to learn going forward, and we can take those action items and post them as articles, or maybe even run future webinars with yourselves. Okay, so the first request is tangible examples of decarbonizations from your clients, and you wouldn't have to wait much because next month we have a session on exactly that point. As my colleague Mina posted in the chat, reducing software emissions will actually be covered in our next webinar on how to decarbonize the emissions from your software. So you'll hear from other experts from our Plan A team. Who accounts for much carbon to avoid double counting? Great question. We will perhaps discuss some of these elements in the Q&A session. What data do I need as a company? Deep dive into how we calculated the emissions. So on the deep dive into how we calculated the emissions, I would encourage you to go on our website and the software and IT page. We explain quite a lot of elements there, but please feel free to also book a demo and arrange a session with some of our team, because that's exactly what we would typically do at demo sessions. We will talk people through the exact calculation methods and how they would go about using our software. For me, it would be interesting to see how I actually have to measure my cloud emissions. On that point, after the session, what we'll also do is send a short guide document. It'll be very short, a few pages, on actually how you can extract your business activity data from AWS to calculate your emissions. So we'll actually send you some more tips and tricks on complementing and supplementing the items we covered in today's session. because we want you to continuously learn. Great. I think that was really helpful. Actually, if we go into the final slide and we enter the Q&A, and we're right on time. Brilliant. So we've got a few questions, and please feel free to add more as we go. So the first one is, how can we measure the impact of IT infrastructure? Ari, do you want to come on this one?
Yes, thank you, Dzhordzhio. Okay, so definitely these are important topics in the looking at the whole Scope 3 scenario. First of all, it's very important to understand our operational boundaries, to understand what is actually important and relevant to report in our corporate carbon footprint. These, though, are also different topics. So e-waste, for example, is to be accounted by considering the actual amount of waste that we produce, and then, of course, how this is recovered or disposed of. So it's a waste topic that it's actually very interesting and needs a specific data collection in that case. And supply chain emissions and hardware life cycle, it's also like a big topic. Luckily, there is a lot of data out there, especially from the companies that produce hardware themselves, because they're also very much on top of calculating their emissions. So through the information that can be collected by companies that provide your hardware, it's possible to account for that as well. And supply chain, it's always quite it is a very big topic always as well, but there is many informations out there. As usual, the data collection is always the hard part that needs quite some work, but accounting for the amount of hardware, the usage of it, I would say that we need quite some work in the beginning, but then the informations can be provided and integrated in order to calculate the emissions related to these topics.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer, Ari. So there's an overall comment that's reflecting on people enjoying the session, so very much appreciated. We will gladly accept this compliment, of course. So let's go to some of the other questions. I'll take one on AI and LLMs and perhaps tag Larry in. So the question, and I'm taking them in chronological order. How well are emissions associated with use of AI LLMs understood and incorporated into reporting requirements and standards? So AI and LLM tools are in a way not that much fundamentally different than other software tools, purely from a carbon accounting perspective. And the difference might come in is in which category, and we've had actually long debates on how we support our clients on this, on categorizing effectively the emissions. And Larry will, of course, confirm my assumptions as the expert, but in very simple terms, if you're effectively training your model and you don't have any active users, all of the emissions associated with training the model, and if it's an AI company, might be in one category that might be under Scope 2 or Scope 3, depending on how your company is structured and whether you own some of the data centers or whether you're leasing them. And if your company has successfully launched the AI product and it's actually used by users, you would typically follow the methodology that we've demonstrated and that we've talked you through. And Larry, am I correct in explaining these terms?
Yeah, Dzhordzhio, that's exactly right. So when we look at GHG protocol, and if you look at the operational control, it's really important to look whether you're looking at the development phase where you train the models, which could have high emissions when in the, whether it's the hardware you own. Also, we need to look at whether you're renting cloud services. So it really depends on where is your data center, what devices are you training your model on, what is the infrastructure that you're using to train this model. So it's really sometimes hard to determine what are the emissions associated with AI and LLMs. And also this being new technology, there hasn't been a lot of research on calculating emissions from AI and LLMs. But we do know that the emissions from these training these models could be really high. But in the end, it really depends who owns the hardware, what phase you're looking at, and who has the operational control on the development and the use phase.
Brilliant. Thanks, Larry. And on this point, to answer some of the questions on standards, this is where, as a reminder to all of our colleagues, the GHG protocol is pretty much industry agnostic. So it provides a framework for measuring emissions from all sorts of companies. And Plan A is involved with initiatives with the United Nations, who are actively looking to commission effectively standards-based organizations like ISO to develop sector-specific standards on measuring some of these points. So to bring us back to the learnings, you can measure the emissions from these softwares using the GHG protocol, but very specific sector-specific standards are in development that effectively detail in a bit more granular level how to exactly measure them, but they're still in development. Okay, so if we go, just as a quick point on one of the questions was how can software developers balance the trade-off between performance optimization and energy efficiency? And on this question, I would highly advise you to watch our decarbonization webinar, because that's where we'll be discussing all of those fascinating and exciting points. So on Ari or Larry, I'll just pose the question to both of you if you want to add a point. To avoid double counting, how would you account for carbon as a hardware provider, operating systems provider, or an application provider? And perhaps you can talk about the different boundaries and summarize, because I think that touches upon some of the previous questions that we've had.
Larry, you can take.
Yeah, I can take it. Dzhordzhio, can you just maybe highlight the question on the Slido?
Yep, it has 3 likes. So I'll paraphrase perhaps, is effectively the question is, how would you account your carbon emissions if you're a hardware provider versus an operating systems provider versus an application provider? And I think if the person wants to clarify, because I'm assuming the operating system provider in this case is iOS, or it's more linked to the device that we use. So perhaps you can more explain the hardware versus the software and the operational boundaries.
Yeah. So yeah, if you're looking at the S3C11, which is use of sold products, then there would usually be a double counting between different companies, because essentially what you're doing is the hardware that is being used to run the software provider would also allocate a part of those emissions from running the hardware into your emissions calculations. And GHG protocol does also acknowledge that there could be some double counting between different companies who sell a product, but then is also used by another company to develop a product on top of it. In this case, it's hardware, but there's also software being run on top of the hardware. So the hardware provider would only calculate for emissions from the hardware itself. So it could be the idle power state of running the hardware. The operating system provider could calculate emissions from your idle state plus whatever energy goes into running the operating system, which essentially I think would be the same for the hardware provider as well. But the difference for the software provider is that you would also add the emissions or the energy consumption that goes into running your software. So you have idle power state of the operating system powering your hardware, plus you have the active state where the application that you're running consumes additional power on top of the idle power that is consumed by the hardware. So yeah, to summarize, your hardware and operating system provider emissions would be similar, whereas the software systems provider would be slightly higher because you're running another layer on top of the existing operating system and the hardware layer. Yeah.
Thanks, Larry. And I think that also answers one of the other questions on hardware as direct versus operating system as indirect. So brilliant. And on a more fundamental point, this is what you raise in that there may be some double counting between companies. The most important fundamental principle of the GHG protocol is that you don't double account for the same emissions within your own boundaries. So this is where categorizations and actually being really careful how you categorize emissions within your own boundaries is critical. And if there is some double counting between different types of companies. This will also, as perhaps it will be discussed to some degree in the decarbonization webinar, but we also have to remind ourselves that if those emissions are reduced, then they will reduce for both companies because they're both counting them. And that's effectively the principle of Scope 3 is how companies are interconnected. Okay, and I think we've covered most of the questions, but there's one on how to measure software use phase emissions with primary data. And Larry, maybe you can just illuminate people about what they'll receive in the guidance, for example, in collecting some of the business activity data for use phase emissions.
Yeah, so if you're looking at primary data, so basically you would collect energy consumption data from your users, from your network provider, and also from the data center, which is where your software is being stored and it's run through the cloud, for example. So, for example, if you take AWS, you could go to the Cost Explorer. You could look into your production environment, because that is the use phase where your application is being used by the user. And you could look at how much data transfer is being done, or how much data storage was used in the production environment. And this is basically the primary data that you could bring into the platform and do those calculations to calculate the emissions from the data center. And when it comes to the end user devices, for example, you could do surveys with the users to understand exactly how we did at the beginning of this webinar. We collected data on what device are you running. So you could do a similar survey with your users and collect data on what devices they're running, and also look up power consumption data of these devices. Additionally, what you could also do is run internal tests. When you're developing your software, you can test it on different devices that you're developing the software for, and try to measure the power consumption, because there are different apps which could show you how much power is being consumed when your software is being run. So there are multiple ways where you could get primary data for the software, and you could bring into the app to calculate your emissions from primary data.
Brilliant, thank you. Ari, any final notes to add on this, on the flexibility of different types of data? Because I think we've answered most of the questions.
Yeah, just to add that even though it's quite a complex topic, but as I said, we have done a lot of the research in order to guide you through it. And again, there's always some need of collaboration, so to find out information, but the more we delve into it, the easier it gets, and to be able to account about this topic. It's such an important and relevant topic for our daily lives that also the research is going on and providing us more and more information. So I'm very happy to support you with this.
Of course. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ari and Larry. And of course, we're keeping an eye on the time and on the global news. So if Mr. Musk sends us an email about what we have done today, I'm pretty confident that we can respond to that. So hopefully it was a very valuable session to you all. It is a really important topic, because some of the emissions associated with all of this software products that we use will add significantly to the environmental burden, but they can also act as a catalyst for decarbonization. And with this note, I will remind everyone that there's a very fascinating session coming up in the next few weeks. The link is in the chat, so do please register for that. And on that note, I would like to thank our presenters, and hopefully you enjoyed this session as much as I did. I certainly learn a lot from them every day. And we wish you a wonderful day and all the best.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Dzhordzhio.